Hi, so in this video we will be discussing some cognitive biases which affect people in their decision making. So in previous videos we've talked about rationality of consumers and of different economic agents, and when we think about rational decisions we think about an individual making a decision that maximizes their utility or their welfare. And when we are thinking about behavioural economics, we start to think that in reality, individuals and just people in society do tend to suffer from these biases which influence the decisions that individuals make, and they stop individuals from making completely rational decisions. And so these biases which are influencing these decisions we can call cognitive biases. So just natural things in all of our brains that make us not to make completely rational decisions. And there are loads and loads of these cognitive biases that we have, and some of them may seem obvious, other ones less so. But if we're thinking about an introductory economics course, we can come up with some of these examples. So these are some examples of biases that people tend to have. You may not see these as biases, but these are the sorts of things that we think of when we think individuals aren't doing perfectly maximizing behavior. They're not maximizing their utility or their welfare because they are being biased in, or they're naturally going to have a tendency to do some of these things which I would list here. So the first of these, which lots of people do, is that we have habitual consumption, or just we have lots of habits in our behavior. So we can describe this by just thinking that lots of consumers tend to repeat the same consumption patterns, even if there is good reason to do something else. So a key example of this will be perhaps in the supermarket, where each person shops. They tend to choose one supermarket, and each week they just go back to the supermarket. They don't really check the prices of other supermarkets. They will just keep going back to the same place because they're familiar with it, because they've built a habit. And it doesn't matter if, say, a new supermarket comes onto the block with much lower prices. Lots of people will tend to just ignore that and keep doing the same thing. When we think of habitual consumption, we can also think of addiction, things like smoking and alcohol consumption. There's loads of examples of habitual consumption. People do tend to be very habitual in all walks of life in things they do. We tend to do the same thing again because it takes a lot of time to research things and change our mind, and we get used to a certain way of doing things. Our second example of a cognitive bias is we have what we might describe as rule of thumb behavior. So consumers often simplify their decision making using these rules of thumb rather than calculating the optimal choice every time around. So the example we may use here is if we have three options. Say we have a small popcorn for £5, a large popcorn for £10, and that was wrong. We'll say medium popcorn for £10 and large popcorn for £15. Lots of people are going to tend to choose the middle option just because it's middle of the road. And the same could be said if we had some sort of pricing strategy, which is, say, a small one was £8 and the large one was £20, then even if we were originally thinking of getting the small one, we'd say, okay, the £10 one, that's only £2 extra. Even if we don't want lots of popcorn, we might choose the middle one because of the way the prices are laid out. So this is just one rough example off the top of my head, but we do often see consumers just sort of using these rules of thumb where we say, oh, okay, this middle one is only £2 more, so we may as well get it. When in reality, if we were to calculate the optimal choice, we'd maybe start to think that, okay, I don't actually want that much popcorn, so spending this extra £2 on popcorn is not really worth it because I'm not going to eat any more than a small popcorn, and so on. We don't tend to go through all this reasoning and this optimal choice calculation process because it's just time consuming, and in our natural life we don't really care that much about making the optimal decision every time, especially if we're, say, at a cinema and we're just relaxing and we're just choosing a popcorn, making a quick snap choice. We don't want to go through the reasoning process. where we say, actually, I would prefer to have this different option. So we tend to have rules of thumb which just speed up our decision making, and we just quickly make a snap decision. But in these snap decisions, the way our brains work, we tend to make a non-optimal or a suboptimal decision. Our third example of a cognitive bias is going to be anchoring. And this is where consumers tend to put too much value on one piece of information. So what is our example here? Well, let's consider that we are trying to find out how much our car insurance is going to cost, and we're a new car owner, and so we've never had any experience of how much car insurance is, and we go to a website and they tell us, okay, it's going to cost you £100 for a year of car insurance. And once we get this quote, we tend to put a lot of emphasis on this piece of information and say, okay, £100 per year, that's a pretty standard price for car insurance, because we don't know anything else. And it doesn't matter how many car insurance places we go to. If we see loads of other sites and one says it's £300, another says it's £400, another one says £350, we're going to think that these are all really expensive and these are all really expensive prices, when in reality these are all pretty standard prices for a year of car insurance, but this £100 was just a really good deal. And so this is just, again, one example, but we tend to view the first price that we see as being a fair price, and we're really anchored to this idea because it's the first piece of information we have received, when in reality prices tend to be very different. And the opposite can be true. If we see initially a price that says, okay, you're going to have to pay £400 for car insurance, even if we found 3 other sites after this that said we could have £100 for car insurance, our natural reaction to that would be that, okay, this is cheap and there's something wrong with this car insurance. It's maybe worse because it's really cheap in comparison to this anchored view I've had that £400 is a fair price, when in reality it's just the fact that the first price I saw was way too expensive. So that's just an introduction to anchoring, and maybe a bad example, but consumers tend to put a lot of value on one piece of information, or just the information that they know. They assume that the information that they are aware of is going to be correct a lot more than it is, and it's often not the case. So our next example is going to be social norms. This is a cognitive bias, and consumers tend to be influenced a lot by their social group or society as a whole does, rather than what they themselves see as optimal. And so I'm not sure this is necessarily as much of a cognitive bias, that people naturally do try to fit in, and this could be built into our utility function, that people are just trying to fit in with other people. But we can come up with examples of things like an individual does not want to smoke because they see smoking or cigarettes as giving them negative utility, as being a demerit good, for example. But if their friendship group smokes, they will perhaps be influenced and start to smoke themselves, even though it offers them negative utility, and so it's not an optimizing decision. They decide to smoke because they are influenced by what their social circle does. And so again, this is another bias, which we may describe it as, because in trying to fit in and follow social norms, we are making suboptimal decisions. And so the final bias that I will use in this example, or in this video, as I say, there are lots of other biases that we can have, but here's the final one I will quickly go over in this video, is going to be availability bias. And this is where judgments regarding the likelihood of an event are based on how easy it is to remember that event occurring in the past. So a good example for this might be the likelihood of being in a plane crash. And this is one thing that makes lots of people stop going on planes, or have a fear of flying that will maybe not stop them going on a plane, but it'll make them less likely to want to go on a plane journey, is that you remember all these stories about plane crashes because they have a lot of news coverage, and we see on the news whenever there is a plane that goes down, it does tend to be reported. And so people tend to increase their likelihood of a plane crash because they remember lots of plane crashes being reported. In reality, we have thousands and thousands of plane journeys every day that do not crash, and the actual likelihood of a plane going down is extremely small. I don't know the exact value, but it's going to be 0.000 something. And however, we might put a value of 1% of our plane going down. Obviously, still a low value. Some people might think that there's a 1% chance of their plane going down, when in reality the figure is going to be a lot more zeros before that 1%. So we think of availability bias as we judge things on the likelihood if we remember something happening. And so the opposite can be true, that we think a volcanic eruption is very unlikely because this volcano has not erupted in our lifetime. However, if a volcano tends to erupt every 60 years, well, it may be quite likely that an eruption is going to happen, but because I'm younger than 60, I would not necessarily remember an eruption coming, so I just assume there's no chance that this volcano is going to erupt. So this was a brief introduction to some cognitive biases with a couple of examples, so they were hopefully easier to understand. That will just about wrap it up for this video, so do leave a like if this was at all useful. Check out the playlist for more introductory economics videos, and subscribe for some econ in your subscription feed.